Was Bernie Sanders the rightful winner of the Democratic primaries in both 2016 and 2020? Did he fail to win the nomination both times because the Democratic establishment put up barriers against him that were unfair, thus rigging the system to affect the outcome of these two races? That is what has been alleged by veteran newscaster and Washington insider Mark Halperin. And he's not the only one. I've heard others make this case as well. But when such a prominent political pundit makes this pronouncement, as Mark Halperin has done, it carries a certain weight. And he has said this multiple times. Now, let me talk about who Mark Halperin is. He's worked in political journalism for decades, and he co-wrote two best-selling books, Game Change and Double Down. His prominence rose after writing these books, earning him frequent appearances on MSNBC and other stations. And in those books, he really kind of got inside the campaigns and showcased his ability to kind of learn about stuff that usually only the most insider of insiders can know about. But after a Me Too scandal, Halperin's career took a turn, and he recently had to reinvent himself as an online commentator, hosting Two Way, a forum for political enthusiasts. On this platform, he has repeatedly made these comments about 2016 and the 2020 races, and each time I have thought about exploring this topic on a video, so I've finally gotten around to doing so. Now, for those of you who have seen my other presidential election videos, I usually cover each election in a holistic way, educating people on the issues, the history of the time periods, many of the candidates, including minor ones, and the horse race aspect of the elections. I may at some point do videos like that on 2016 and 2020, but this video will be something different, as I'll be looking at these primaries, but specifically focusing on how close Sanders came to winning and whether or not the actions of the DNC and other parts of the Democratic establishment was the factor that impeded him enough to change the results. And I'll link the videos to the earlier election videos that I've done in the description, as I think watching those videos will get you a sense of the ins and outs of the primary process and how they work and different things that can affect outcomes. And I think that will be important to know as we explore this topic here. So let's get started and talk a little bit about what happened here. So there's three separate questions here, and I think it's important as we explore this to differentiate between these questions. First off, did the DNC and the Democratic establishment take measures to make it more difficult for Bernie Sanders to win the nomination? And if yes, how extreme were those measures? Okay, did they do sort of a typical hardball politics, or was it something more profound and more serious than that? And then finally, did these measures, if they did take them, keep Bernie Sanders from winning? Would he have lost anyway, or did he specifically lose because of these measures that the Democratic establishment took? And it's that last question that I really want to focus most on in this video, and that's not to say that those other two questions are not important. And it could be that the Democratic establishment did do some things that were unethical, and it's important to think about that, to learn about that, to know whether or not that is the case. But I'm only going to touch on that a little bit in this video. I'll leave it to others to maybe explore that question in a little bit more detail. I'll touch on it, but I really want to focus mostly on the election analysis. Okay, did Bernie Sanders have enough support to win? And that's what I want to mainly focus on. Todd Devine was somebody who worked on Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign, and he has written a book espousing the view that the DNC did indeed rig the system to thwart his candidate. Devine has appeared on interviews with Mark Halperin and Michael Smarklanish. If you want to get a better idea of how the DNC is said to have gotten in the way of Bernie Sanders' success, I would suggest watching these interviews or indeed reading Devine's book. I'll briefly summarize his points here. First, let me dispose of the weakest of Devine's arguments, which regards superdelegates. These superdelegates are party insiders. They're able to vote in Democratic conventions, or at least they were at the time, potentially affecting the nominating process and possibly tipping the scale away from the candidate with the most votes won by primary elections. In earlier American history, nominations were decided by conventions comprised of party insiders. Primaries are a relatively recent thing. Primaries are thought to be more democratic than the conventions, but the thing is, Bernie Sanders didn't lose because of superdelegates. He got less of the pledged delegates because he got less votes in the primaries. Devine talks about how this affected the media narrative in the 2016 race, but he overstates this. Now, in 2008, it affected the media narrative more as the election was closer that year, and it appeared possible that year that Barack Obama was going to win the pledged delegates while Hillary Clinton had more superdelegates. But eventually, enough superdelegates went with the will of the voters, and the controversy was diffused. By 2016, 2008 had already happened, and most people assumed that the superdelegates would play out the same way as they did in 2008, and it really didn't dominate the narrative as much as Devine suggested it did. The debate schedule was a source of controversy. It often is in political campaigns. Typically, candidates that are behind want to have more debates, as that provides more opportunities to shake things up, and candidates that are ahead want to have less debates and play it safe. And that happened here with Hillary Clinton wanting to have less debates. But it appears as though the DNC was willing to go along with Hillary's wishes, and they more or less acquiesced to the debate schedule that she wanted. Now, the debates that they did have were not exactly difference makers. Sanders did okay in them, but he didn't exactly knock it out of the ballpark in a game-changing way that would have shaken up the dynamics of the race. Now, maybe if they had had more debates, maybe he would have had that great debate opportunity, and that could have potentially changed the dynamic. We don't know. But based on what we can see from the debates that they did have, he was an okay debater, but it really didn't seem to make that much difference in the overall dynamic of the race. Now, there was another controversy about the timing of some of these debates. They happen at times when maybe there wouldn't be as high a viewership, like right before Christmas. So that was another thing that Sanders thought was unfair. He wanted an opportunity to have more Americans kind of hear what he had to say, and he thought that the DNC was kind of conspiring against him and trying to help Hillary Clinton by giving her the debate schedule that she wanted. And one reason why they think the DNC was so willing to give Hillary what she wanted was that her campaign finances and the DNC's finances were intertwined in a way that was irregular, as she had loaned the DNC money to pay off debts. This financial arrangement could very well have led to situations where, when they needed the DNC to be a neutral referee, it could have compromised the DNC, and maybe they were not so neutral after all. Later leaked emails to the DNC and the Clinton campaign shared a lot of information, but there was a controversy about the information that they did not share with the Sanders campaign about voters. Typically, party committees provide information about voter rolls to the different candidates running, but the DNC penalized Sanders and withheld that information from him and his campaign for a period of about a week. His campaign was penalized because there was a data breach, and Sanders' campaign accessed information it was not supposed to access. So this penalty resulted from this, and the DNC then withheld this voter roll information from his campaign. And after Sanders' campaign complained about the penalty, he was allowed access again. But by denying him this information, it could have affected his organizational efforts, especially in Iowa, and Iowa would end up being very close. Furthermore, there was a sense that this was part of a broader problem of the DNC being unfair to Sanders because they supported Clinton, and perhaps there were more examples of such biases that we never learned about and that never became public, that maybe went on behind the scenes. Like I said, the Iowa caucuses were very close in 2016. Caucuses are basically local meetings run by party organizers in each community. If the party organizers are biased towards one candidate, that could affect the outcome of the different local meetings and ultimately the state as a whole. And there was a fair amount of chaos and lack of transparency in the 2016 caucus. During certain procedures, coin flips needed to happen, and Clinton seemed to win just about every coin flip, which seems suspicious to a lot of observers. The Sanders campaign and some of his supporters believed that they were the rightful winners of Iowa. Now, Nevada came after Iowa, and it had its share of irregularities too. Nevada was not as close, but many political pundits believe that if Sanders had won Iowa, he might have gotten some momentum and perhaps could have done better in Nevada, especially if there weren't irregularities in Nevada as well. I realize I just did a brief overview on these complaints by the Sanders campaign and their allies. It's certainly worth learning about, but I wish to focus more on the election analysis. But what I'll do is I'll refer you to some good sources that are out there that give a more in-depth description on these issues. The Election History Channel did a good video on this, and I think I'll link it to the description. I think that they did a pretty thorough job if you want to learn more about the mechanics of how some of this played out. But what I want to focus on here is this. Let's say every complaint that was raised by Sanders' allies and Tad Devine is true, and the DNC was indeed unfairly biased against Sanders. Was this enough to cause him to lose? You can have a baseball game where it is discovered that one of the winning pitchers was throwing a few spitballs, but if the game ended with a 5-run lead, can you conclude that the other team would have made up those 5 runs and won if not for those spitballs? We can't know for sure, but there are ways we can look at the information and make a pretty close guess. Or let's say a referee in a basketball game is biased and calling more fouls for one team than it is for the other team. Again, in a close game, that can be a difference maker. But what if it's not so close of a game? It's important to know if the ref is biased and if spitballs are being thrown, certainly. But that is different than saying that the losing team outplayed the winning team and would have won if not for that cheating. So did Bernie Sanders lose because of these things that the DNC did? Or did he lose because he wasn't able to get enough voters to vote for him? And that's what I really want to focus mostly on in this video. Sanders supporters tend to include a lot of young and idealistic people. They believe in their causes and their candidate. It's important for them to know if their candidate lost because the system was rigged or if he lost because not enough voters agreed with them about who should have won. They can certainly argue that voters ought to have voted for Sanders and that he should have won, but can they argue that he actually had enough support from voters to win? And when an influential elder statesman like Mark Halperin says definitively that Sanders would have won if not for the DNC shenanigans, idealistic Sanders supporters take that to heart. But it's important that we fully evaluate that question and I think make a sound judgment on whether or not Sanders had enough support to win. My source for a lot of the election data I use is Dave Leap's Atlas of U.S. Elections, an excellent source for information. Here we see the caucus and primary results for 2016 in the Democratic race. About 10 or so states in 2016 did caucuses, and mostly those were smaller states. The overwhelming majority did primaries. Primaries are run by the state, and caucuses are run by the party. Now, one might expect a party insider to do like Clinton to do better in caucuses since caucuses are run by the party, but in both 2016 and in 2008, she actually underperformed in caucuses overall. Obama and Sanders got more caucus support because caucuses require more time commitment, and Obama and Sanders had more enthusiastic supporters. But in the primaries, which most states had primaries, Clinton here in 2016 won by 13 percentage points and almost 4 million votes. So it wasn't really that close of a race. And to think that a change in the debate schedule or the Sanders campaign losing access to voter roll information for a week was going to change 4 million votes, I think is misguided. I think the margins here were pretty large, and it was going to take something, I think, bigger for Sanders to be able to make up for those fairly large numbers. So let's look at some polls. And again, here we see Clinton having just very strong support amongst Democrats throughout America. And these polls here on this page are from the summer of 2015, so before the election. And we see Clinton having a commanding lead. Her biggest lead is that CBS poll where she's got a 41-point advantage. I think her smallest lead here is 18%, but it's double digits across the board throughout the summer. And then these numbers here reflect the fall, and Clinton continued to have a double-digit lead throughout the fall months as well. Some polls had her with a slightly smaller lead, like there was one here with 16%, but the other polls had her with at least a 31 point lead. So a pretty commanding lead across the board, averaging probably 20 or so as far as the point differential between her and Sanders. And now, as we get into the early part of 2016 and I guess the very end of 2015, we still see Clinton having a commanding lead. Now, the couple of these polls have Sanders knocking it down to single digits. We see the kind of two in the middle there where Clinton only has a 4 and 7 point lead respectively. But then as we get later in the month, her lead starts to increase again. So she's continuing to consistently lead Sanders throughout the entire months leading up to the primaries and caucuses. And now we see some more polls here as we move a little bit later into 2016. Now there are a few that where Sanders does have a small lead, but those polls only have him ahead by 1 or 2 points, and those are his best numbers. And so averaging out, Clinton is going to have the lead across the entire season. With a few of these polls with Sanders in the lead are kind of outliers, and his polling lead is kind of within the margin of error. So basically, Clinton had the lead throughout the polls, and she had more votes. So it is hard to say that Sanders was the one who really had the support of primary voters in the Democratic Party. But primaries are not national contests. They trickle out state by state over a course of time, and an underdog candidate has the potential to overperform in early states and gain momentum and eventually take the national lead if the system is not rigged against him. But is this momentum factor as big of a deal as it is often made out to be? I know a lot of political pundits, perhaps like Mark Halperin, kind of believe in the idea of doing well in these early states and the outsized influence they have. But let's examine whether or not that is actually the case, or whether or not primaries and caucuses are maybe more of a national thing than the media sometimes treats it as. So I know underdog candidates often dream about winning over those smaller early states and then building that momentum over time, but is that what usually happens? So one time where that really did kind of play out was the case of the 2004 Democratic nomination process. So that year, John Kerry would end up emerging as the Democratic nominee, and it really didn't seem like that was going to happen for most of 2003. Kerry was kind of mired in a sort of middle tier campaign. He was third or fourth in most national polls, and in the Iowa polls, it looked like the front runner at different points of time was Joe Lieberman. Later, it seemed to be Howard Dean, and both Wesley Clark and Dick Gephardt were first tier candidates. At different points, they were ahead of Kerry. So it really didn't look like Kerry would be much of a factor, but things really kind of aligned for him, and he would end up winning Iowa. But I would argue that that wasn't a sort of normal case, that was kind of an outlier, and it really was different because of how much things kind of fell into place for Kerry. So you had Howard Dean maybe peaking a little too early, maybe he was prone to some gaffes. We saw Wesley Clark maybe make the decision to skip Iowa, so when Kerry got all that media attention, that Wesley Clark didn't really have much attention at that point. We saw Lieberman's campaign kind of fizzle out because of his continued support for the Iraq War. And then Dick Gephardt, he and Howard Dean ended up beating each other up a lot in Iowa and hurting each other. And Kerry really benefited from that by kind of being above the fray and being the beneficiary of the two other candidates kind of attacking each other. So things really kind of fell into place. He got some positive media attention. He was able to really play up his experience as a veteran, which helped him, I think, in that campaign. He gave a pretty good speech. A man not known for good speeches gave one of the best speeches of his career right before the Iowa caucus. So all that kind of played in. It snowballed. He won the Iowa caucus, then won many more states after that. He won like 44, 45 states after Iowa. So you could point to that example and say, okay, well, maybe if Bernie Sanders had an Iowa caucus result like John Kerry, maybe things could have snowballed for him as well. But I think it's important to look at other elections and other years to see if whether or not that kind of thing is normal or whether or not this happening to Kerry was kind of an outlier. For example, if we look at the 1988 Democratic primaries, Dick Gephardt won Iowa that year, and he did get some momentum. Okay, he did pick up some support after that, and he got second place in New Hampshire, which was an overperformance perhaps for him. But he did very little after that, and he dropped out shortly after New Hampshire because he didn't have enough momentum to carry him forward. He struggled to raise money, and his poll numbers in the states after New Hampshire did not look that good. So while he won Iowa, it did not present him with the huge amount of momentum to kind of fuel a successful campaign after that. Also in 1988, we would see Bob Dole win the Iowa caucus. And again, he gained a little bit of momentum from that, but it wasn't enough to really make him a front runner. And he ended up losing later primaries and ended up not being successful in getting the Republican nomination that year. In 2008, we would see Mike Huckabee win Iowa. And again, he got a little momentum from that. He probably performed a little bit better in New Hampshire than he otherwise would have if he hadn't won Iowa. But his showing in New Hampshire was just a third place showing. And in later states, yeah, he won a few states later on, but he ended up not getting the Republican nomination. He ended up, losing out to McCain after all was said and done. Now, in the Democratic side in 2008, we would see Barack Obama win Iowa. And yes, he picked up some momentum and he did eventually win the nomination. But if you look more closely, you say, yes, he won Iowa, but that wasn't enough momentum to win him New Hampshire the next week. Hillary Clinton bounced back. She won New Hampshire, then came Nevada the next week, and she got more votes than Obama in Nevada. So with those states, the momentum from Iowa didn't really make too much of a difference. And then the next week we had South Carolina, and you would say, okay, well, maybe Clinton got some momentum from her showings in both New Hampshire and Nevada, but actually in South Carolina, Obama came back with a blowout victory. And a lot of that race in 2008 was something of a seesaw. It went back and forth. When they had states where the demographics favored Clinton, she tended to win. If the demographics favored Obama more, he tended to win. And the momentum really didn't carry over much from state to state across that primary battle. Even as we got later in the calendar, where you would think, okay, Obama almost became the presumptive nominee in that late stage as we got towards the spring, but Clinton was still winning states in that late stage. It wasn't enough momentum by Obama, the wins that he got, to keep Clinton from continuing to win certain states even in the later spring of that year. So with that in mind, let's look at these Iowa caucus results. And indeed, statewide, it was the narrowest of margins. It was very close. Clinton edged out Sanders. And you might argue that small things could have made a difference with that margin. Perhaps if they had a few extra debates, maybe Sanders would end up winning. Maybe that lack of access to that voter roll for that short period of time could have made a difference when the percentage is that small. Maybe those coin flips could have made a difference. So little things could have made a difference when you have that small of a margin. I have no doubt. And it could be argued, I think accurately, maybe that Sanders ought to have been the winner of the Iowa caucus. But does that mean that he would have won the overall primary race across the country? Now, the idea that the Sanders supporters had was that maybe if he had won the caucus, he would have gotten that momentum like John Kerry did in 2004. But I'm not so sure. Kerry's example was an outlier. We saw all those other examples where momentum really didn't play as much of a factor when all those other candidates had won in Iowa. So I don't really think you can safely say that if Sanders had won Iowa, it would have made all that difference. And that's the point Halpern makes. And I tend to disagree with him on that. So after Iowa, we have New Hampshire, and Bernie Sanders here bounces back with a pretty sizable victory over Clinton in New Hampshire. Ironically, it's something of the opposite of what we saw in 2008. She got third place in Iowa in 2008, and a lot of people thought she might have been out for the count, and then she bounced back with a win in New Hampshire. Here in 2016, she wins Iowa and then gets trounced in New Hampshire. So Sanders could potentially get momentum from this victory moving forward. So then we have Nevada as the third contest. And really, we see a pretty similar result in the Nevada caucus in 2016 as we did in 2008. Hillary Clinton gets about a 5-point lead over Bernie Sanders here. Now, in 2008, Obama managed to get more delegates out of Nevada because of where his vote came from. That doesn't happen here. She got the delegate advantage. So she does win Nevada, and, again, a 5-point lead. Fairly close, but not as close as Iowa. Again, you might think, okay, maybe there were some shenanigans with the Democratic Party, the Democratic establishment, the DNC, but really could that make a difference in a 5-point race? Maybe, but it does seem like Sanders had a hard time winning over enough of those caucus voters to edge her out in Nevada. And then we have South Carolina, the fourth state to have a contest. And this was not close at all. It was an absolute blowout. Hillary Clinton wins by almost 50 points here, 73% to 26% here, with a pretty large delegate differential. So with that much of a commanding victory, and we see it's almost a 200,000 vote difference, even if Sanders had managed to win Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada 3 in a row, it's hard to imagine this many voters in South Carolina voting differently because he had maybe small victories in Iowa and Nevada, maybe a pretty big victory in New Hampshire. It seems like the voters of South Carolina were strongly in favor of Hillary Clinton. And perhaps if things had played out differently, maybe it wouldn't have been a 50-point difference, but it would have been, I think, a pretty big win for Hillary no matter what had happened in those earlier three states. So the momentum would have really slowed down in any kind of scenario where she ends up with a commanding victory here in South Carolina. And it seems like it would have been commanding no matter what with that large of a victory. All right, so we have the early states out of the way. Now let's look nationally again. The green states were won by Bernie Sanders. The red states were won by Hillary Clinton. And as you can see, states in the South tended to support Clinton more. States in the North tended to support Sanders more. What we also see is states with larger populations tended to support Clinton more, and states with lower populations tended to support Sanders more. Now, here's the thing to remember to get the nomination. The size of the state matters. So the more population in the state, the more delegates that state is going to have. Also, the percentage differential matters. If you win by a larger percent, you get a larger number of the delegates of that state. A state with a close differential isn't going to yield as many delegates for that candidate. So let's look at the largest states and how they voted in this election. Now, Bernie Sanders sort of fancies himself as being a man of the people, so we want to look at the states that have the most people. And the way Tad Devine kind of presented his case in the book, it was as though Sanders had this kind of popular support. So I think looking at states with the largest populations, I think can give you an idea of who actually had the popular support of the Democratic primary electorate. So let's start with the state with the largest population, California. So we see a 7-point or so victory for Hillary Clinton. So it's not exactly a landslide. She does get the win, and it's within single digits. She does get some more delegates, but it's not a blowout victory by any means. And I think if you kind of know a little bit about California's demographics, I think there's certain parts of the state where maybe Bernie Sanders was very popular and he could, carry a lot of voters. But then there were also other parts of the state where the demographics favored Clinton a little bit better. So we see a somewhat narrow victory. California's maybe looks a little bit like Nevada with its vote totals, and maybe the demographics are somewhat similar between the two states. But then we see Texas, which is the state with the second largest population, and that was a blowout. That was not close at all. We see Hillary Clinton with a 30-point victory in Texas. So when you have the second biggest state in the country and the differential is 30 points, that's a big difference, and the delegate difference was very big indeed there. So when Sanders' campaign is going to ask itself, okay, why did we lose? when you're getting that kind of vote total in Texas, the second biggest state, that's going to be a big reason. You got to be able to persuade more of those voters to vote for you. And it doesn't look like the Sanders campaign was able to do that. Now let's look at the third, fourth, and fifth most populated states in the country. So we have New York, which had been Hillary Clinton's home state, or at least the state that she moved to. She was a senator from there. Bernie Sanders was actually born and raised in New York, but he later moved to Vermont. But we do see Hillary Clinton getting the win there. It wasn't as big of a blowout as Texas was, but it was a bigger lead than California was. We see a 17-point victory. So the third largest state goes to Hillary Clinton with a fairly large percentage difference. And again, she's expanding that delegate total as well. Now, the next state we have is Florida. Now, Florida is going to be a little bit more like Texas, and we're going to see another blowout victory there. Again, that's the fourth largest. Actually, in this point, I don't know if Florida had overtaken New York and become the third largest state by this point, maybe it did. But we see a 30-point victory here. And, again, when you're trying to win over votes and trying to win the nomination of the party, and you're losing by 30 points in both the second biggest and third or fourth biggest state in Texas and Florida, then that's not going to bode well for your effort. So Bernie Sanders here losing again, and losing pretty big in another big state. And then the one at the bottom there is Pennsylvania. And again, we see a double-digit victory for Hillary Clinton in Pennsylvania as well. So she's sweeping the five biggest states, and with for the five, it's double-digit lead. And that's really why Bernie Sanders failed to get the Democratic nomination, is he failed to get enough of the voters from these larger states to vote for him. Moving down the line with other large states, we see Illinois. Now, that one was pretty close. So the delegate difference was tied, actually, between Clinton and Sanders. She won slightly more votes than Sanders, but it was tied in delegates. So Illinois would end up being pretty close. Ohio would be a victory for Hillary Clinton, another double-digit victory. And then Michigan would be the largest state to go with Bernie Sanders. So he would end up winning Michigan by about a percentage point, and that would earn him 2 more delegates. So you had to go down the list. She swept basically the 7 most populous states, and it took the 8th most populous state before we got a Sanders victory, and that one would only be a narrow victory in Michigan. And then we see New Jersey, Georgia, and North Carolina, and we see Hillary Clinton again with double-digit victories in these states, and in some of them it's quite a blowout. I believe, yes, we have New Jersey as the first one, and it looks like that is, a 25-point difference. Then we have Georgia and another blowout. Like South Carolina, we see, not only is Clinton winning these southern states, but, she's basically dominating in these southern states. He just does not seem to be able to garner up much support in those states, and that's going to end up costing him in the delegate total. And North Carolina, while not as big of a difference as Georgia was and South Carolina was, we still see Hillary Clinton with a double-digit victory in North Carolina. So these are the 11th largest states, and Bernie Sanders was only able to win one, and he won that one very narrowly. So let's talk a little bit about demographics, and I think the demographics tended to be pretty consistent throughout the polls throughout the primary and caucus season, and also throughout the different states across the country. Bernie Sanders did well with certain types of voters, and Hillary Clinton did well with other types of voters. And some of the types of voters that tended to support Sanders in large numbers included young people, especially college-age people. Both young men and young women voted for Bernie Sanders in very large numbers. So he tended to win a lot of college towns and a lot of states that tended to have an average age that was a little bit lower than the national average. Bernie Sanders tended to do well in those states. He also did pretty well with college-educated voters, especially male college-educated voters, sort of middle to upper middle class types, a lot of folks who had maybe gotten jobs in the tech sector and other industries like that adjacent to that, those tended to be groups of voters that tended to support Sanders in large numbers. And he also did very well with the white working class population. That had been a demographic that had supported Clinton over Obama in 2008, but they really kind of switched to Sanders in 2016. So he was able to win over a large number of those voters. And that's why you might see some of those states with large white working class populations that maybe Clinton had done better in 2008, but we see Sanders doing better in 2016. The problem, though, with Sanders' effort to get the Democratic nomination is some of these demographics, especially white working class men and sort of middle class educated men, a lot of them tended to be drifting more Republican in the years leading up to 2016. And remember, 2016 is the year Donald Trump is also running to get the nomination of the Republican Party. And some of those voters might be choosing to vote in the Republican primary and vote for Donald Trump. So he's kind of competing for those votes with Donald Trump as well as with Hillary Clinton. Now, Clinton had some demographic groups that favored her very strongly. She did very well with black voters in 2016. Now, in 2008, Barack Obama certainly won the black vote overwhelmingly, but that's flipped here in 2016. We see Hillary Clinton winning the black vote overwhelmingly, and we see her winning over professional women very strongly. We see her doing very well with Latino voters, especially Mexican American voters, but I think also Puerto Rican American voters also voted for Hillary Clinton in very large numbers. So she did well with blacks, Hispanics, especially women, professional women, middle-class women, middle-aged women. Those were all groups that supported Hillary Clinton. And those were not groups that were drifting Republican. Those were groups that were strongly in the Democratic camp, and those were voting groups that tended to vote pretty high in primaries. They had a good voter turnout amongst those demographics. She also did very well with seniors, both men and women. So her vote totals among seniors were very strong. And again, the seniors tend to turn out. They tend to be pretty consistent, and she did very well with them. Bernie Sanders, despite being older than Hillary Clinton, really struggled with the votes of seniors. And I think as we look at some of the states with some of those older populations, that could explain why some of them went so strongly for Clinton. And we'll look at the map again in a moment to kind of bear that out. She also did well with Asian voters, a demographic that maybe you don't hear as much about, but she certainly had a strong showing amongst Asian voters, both in 2008 and 2016. So thinking about some of the things we talked about in those last two slides with the demographics, and then looking at the geography and the demography together, we could see a state like Florida and Hillary Clinton winning Florida overwhelmingly. And you think about it, okay, it's a state with a fairly large black population, a fairly large Latino population, and a fairly large population of seniors. Those were all demographics that favored Clinton, so hence her big victory there. And we could look at other states, so states with large black populations like Georgia, the Carolinas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana were all states where Hillary Clinton won overwhelmingly. And we see a state like Texas where she had a very big victory, and again, a state with a somewhat large black population, but also a very large Hispanic population, and she did very well there indeed. And, a state like New York, also another state with large populations of blacks and Hispanics, and she did very well there. So the states where Bernie Sanders won were states that were more rural, smaller states, and wider states. So states like Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Idaho, Washington State, West Virginia, those were all states won by Bernie Sanders. But those states just didn't have enough population. They didn't have enough delegates. And when you think about the Democratic Party and the voting groups that tended to support the Democratic Party more generally, those were the voting groups that Hillary Clinton was backed by more so than Bernie Sanders. My original plan was to talk about both 2016 and 2020 in one video, but I think what I'm going to do is save 2020 for a future video and kind of wrap things up here. So I think Mark Halperin's theory that Bernie Sanders was the rightful winner of the Democratic nomination in 2016, I think it leaves a lot to be desired. And yes, there might have been some shenanigans done by the DNC. There might have been some collusion between the DNC and Hillary Clinton. I have no doubt that that's very possible indeed. And perhaps you could argue that maybe that was very wrong indeed. But I think that that's different than arguing that he had enough support to win the nomination. I think when we look at the numbers, we look at the different states, we look at the different demographics, I think that Bernie Sanders just wasn't able to win over enough voters, and that was why he lost. And whether you support Bernie Sanders or not, I think it's important to know that. I think you have to wrap your head around that and say, okay, well, you may believe in his ideas and you may believe that people should be more supportive of his ideas, but he just wasn't successful enough at selling those ideas to enough people, and that was really the reason why he failed to get the victory. Now, it's okay, I think, to be upset that at the stuff that the DNC did. Maybe you felt like they shortchanged Bernie Sanders and mistreated him, and that's certainly a legitimate gripe. But when Mark Halperin says that he was the rightful winner of the nomination, I think that that's overstating the case. I think when you break it down, I think that Hillary Clinton definitely had more support, and I think that everybody should realize that, I think, as they kind of analyze this for the sake of history and how it affected things moving forward.